All right.
Hey, hey,
We are live. It's just us, Matt, and then
it's
everyone
just
else who's going
us.
to join it, who's going to
It's
join
just
us
us
and
today.
hang out.
No, RJ. We can get down to business.
Exactly. This is the live show. We are coming to you from Passaic, New Jersey, at least in spirit. My name is Brian Brinkman. That is Matt Dwyer, and we are here
Hey,
today, as you can see across the crawl at the bottom of our screen, or if you are listening to this, we are here today to talk about one of, if not the greatest. I think one of us is going to make the argument for the greatest, but one of the greatest Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band concerts of all time. 9/20/78 from Passaic, New Jersey. This is our fourth installment of the Bruce Springsteen archives. I am so excited to dive into this. But before we do that, Matt, how are you doing here today? And how are you feeling after listening to this show?
man, I feel like I could run through a brick wall right now. I wasn't gonna. I actually, I was gonna focus my listening and research on the other shows that we're talking about because I've listened to this show so many times that I could just talk about it from memory. But last night I got into some of the tracks, and this morning I just decided to play the whole thing through. And God, like you don't I tweeted earlier, like I didn't even need coffee this morning. As soon as you came on, it's like, whoa, yeah, like Kool Aid man level of like excitement here. And as you said, this is my favorite Bruce live recording of all time that I've ever heard for a number of reasons that we'll talk about. So when you guys, you and RJ mentioned to me a few weeks ago that you were going to do some Springsteen after the Dave Matthews stuff, I kept pushing in our Slack channel that we had to talk about this show because it's just so amazing, and I'm excited that the day has come.
The day has come. We're in an era that just screams peak Springsteen. We're a couple months following the Darkness on the Edge of Town release. I don't know, I'm really excited to get into this, and I feel like, part of what fascinates me about this era and about this album, just as like a prelude, is this is like that point where he's achieved some success, but he still has that hunger, and he still has, the next 6 years of his career are about chasing some, almost like a ghost, and you can hear it in every note that he sings, in every song that he plays, in every little part of banter that is like filled in between these songs. He is trying to do everything he can to reach every single person in the audience and ensure that they get that spirit and that fire that he is trying to pass out to them. And you hear that throughout this entire album. So like the idea of running through a brick wall, you feel energized, you feel inspired walking out of this, which I loved our conversation yesterday about an 88 show, 7/3/88. That is a very, very different vibe to Bruce Springsteen than this. This is 10 years earlier and so hungry.
He's got something to prove here. He wants the world to know that and the E Street Band are among the all-time great rock and roll live acts. And as opposed to the '75 era, where he maybe was not as confident and kind of fighting his way through the shows. By this point, he knows what he has, and he's going to prove it all night.
He's going to prove it all night. I want to ask you, just before we get into like the specifics around this album. You said that this is your favorite Bruce Springsteen show of all time. Just kind of generally, we touched on this in our first episode about Springsteen, of like how we all got into this guy. What is it that you look for in Springsteen, and why is this album like kind of touch everything that you're looking for in Bruce?
I think there's two sides to it. One is in terms of the performance itself, just the energy that's coming through. I think that's something we're going to talk about a lot today, as we have been already. Just every single note seems so intentional. The entire band is locked in and can turn on a dime with a hand signal or something from Bruce. The set list is fantastic. I mean, playing the classic stuff that he'd been playing up to this point, featuring a lot of Darkness tunes, but then also peppering in stuff that's going to come out on the river, because a lot of that material was written at the same time as the Darkness stuff. So it's kind of a nice look forward about where they're about to go on the next album and the next tour. The other thing, just in terms of this recording, is that it's, I think, the best sounding Bruce and the E Street Band recording that's ever come out. This one was mixed by Bob Clearmountain. If you know Bob, you know he's one of the legends. He mixed Born in the USA. He mixed Roxy Music by Avalon. He's mixed a lot of Bruce stuff. He's mixed a lot of Stones live releases. The dude is just an absolute legend. The speculation was that this show was mixed and prepared potentially to be like a live album that came out on Sony Records, but then they started the live series and then eventually figured that it just made sense to put this out through Nugs. But it stands apart from pretty much every other release in this live series as having just a pristine mix. Every single instrument is crystal clear. You can hear the audience excitement. You can hear things that people are yelling out to Bruce in between songs. If you listen to this recording, it really makes you feel like you're in the room, and I think that adds a lot to the power that the band's exuding throughout this whole show.
Yeah, that last part, like it speaks to a quality recording. And I think about, as I was listening through this show, like my closest comparison was Cornell 77 from the Dead, as well as their some of their 72 releases, like August 72 from Oregon. You get this sense of like the mix of a band at their peak, and a band and an artist and like a songwriter at a creative peak, and at a point where, like we talked about at the top here, they're still hungry, but then also that matches with a recording that captures everything about them. So it's not that you're listening to a live show of theirs that you kind of have to strain to hear certain things, and you have to, like, figure out where are the what other artists are on stage with him. Does he have the full band here? Does you hear every single person come through with absolute clarity. It also sounds, and this kind of speaks to like the in the room feeling, it sounds like everyone is playing as though they have nothing to lose, but also everything to prove at once. And so you get this like high energy, high stakes performance where every single instrument comes through with utmost clarity, but also with like this complete passion behind it. And that mix of like, it's really, really hard to capture that. Sometimes you get a live show that sounds really great, but also falls flat because the band kind of knows that they're being recorded at that point in time. They're trying to overstrain for great performances. This feels raw, it feels authentic, but it also feels polished. And that mixture, that's really, really wild to get.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm excited to talk about some of that stuff in a little bit more detail.
Well, let's dive into it. Just from a venue standpoint, just to give you a bit of background in terms of where the band is at here. This is the Capitol Theater. This is an incredibly famous theater in Passaic, New Jersey. It opened in 1921. It was in existence until 1991, which is just wild to think about, like a theater opening up now here in the early 2020s and like living on through 21st century musical lore and like what stories it could tell. This was a vaudeville house. It then later became a rock venue. It was an adult film cinema in the late 1960s, which just feels very fitting in terms of the type of shows that you would get here. This had a high quality video system in house, which allows for a lot of bootlegs of concerts. There's a great Grateful Dead performance from 1976 that you can watch on YouTube. That's all in black and white, but it's like really clear performance of them from that June 76 run. The first show there was Jay Giles and Humble Pie on December 16th, 1971. And as I noted, the Dead played a really famous run there in 76, also in April of 77. Um, Talk to me just quickly about the Capitol Theater. What comes to your mind when you think about that venue?
All the YouTube videos. I mean, that's one thing that I think their video archives were acquired by Wolfgang's Vault when all of that happened, whenever that was 10, 15 years ago. And
Yeah.
so a lot of that stuff has come out on YouTube. You can actually see it's a fan created bootleg. You can watch the night before this, September 19th, on YouTube, and it's synced to the soundboard recording, which was also released later. So if you want to get a sense of like what that was like in the room, you can go there. But yeah, I mean it's that classic North Jersey, kind of hometown thing for Bruce. The a lot of the shows there were promoted by this guy John Scher, who was kind of like the kingpin of like North Jersey shows for a very long time. You noted in our outline here, you can hear his voice on a lot of different live recordings as doing an introduction. The famous English Town 1977 Grateful Dead show where he introduces Donna as Mrs. Donna Jean Gadchow.
That's the exact sound that comes to my mind when I think about this guy's voice. I love
Exactly.
that.
Yeah. And so he promoted these shows. You can hear his voice at the end of this recording, kind of thanking the crowd for coming out, which is really cool. And John Scher eventually went on to be the guy who produced Woodstock 99 and still to this day denies that it was anything less than a rousing success. So he's sort of legendary, but also infamous.
Yeah. Um, yeah, it's an incredible venue and an incredible space. Like if you think about where Bruce is at, which we're going to get into here in a second, like he's kind of circling North Jersey and the New York metro area during this point in time. There's runs at Madison Square Garden, there's runs at the Palladium, but just to put this show into context, it's really fascinating to think about when this show comes out in 1978, and it's kind of a discussion that we started last week in the conversation around the 1975 show that we did. Bruce straddles this really interesting period in rock history where rock is suddenly becoming like the idea of classic rock is emerging, and Bruce always strikes me, especially in this era, as someone who's trying to hold on to as much greatness from the past as possible and bring it along while using technology and pushing his songs outward with the kind of freedom that you would get from like progressive rock, from improvisational rock, where a song could be stretched for 8 to 12 minutes where it was 3 minutes on an album. But it's also this interesting period, 1978, we're in like the height of disco, we're in the height of you know, pop music is going in a very different direction from rock music where it was a decade earlier. Kind of is defined to me by the fact that two songs from Greece are in the top 10 songs in America at the time of this album: Hopelessly Devoted to You and Summer Nights, which could not be any different. Well, actually, no, I should say like there's a connection piece to Springsteen here because these are songs that are harkening back to the 1950s. And we hear in like the Detroit medley, we hear in Twist and Shout, these moments in a Bruce show where he kind of harkens back to 1950s, 1960s culture as he's bringing it forward. And we're at that point where we're kind of looking back in time. I'm curious for you, like, where do you see Bruce in terms of this period in his career, like where he fits in larger classic rock history? Do you agree with kind of how I've laid this out? Do you have different thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the other thing to add to what you said is that at this period in the late 1970s, there was a lot of nostalgia for the 50s. There
Yeah.
was, Happy Days was a huge show, as I think you noted here. It was one of the top 5 shows in America. So
Yeah.
there was an appetite for that kind of stuff along with Grease. But going back to the origins of the E Street Band, remember that it's a bar band, right? They cut
Yeah.
their teeth playing at, bars in Asbury Park and all over the Jersey Shore, where they had to play multiple sets a night, and people didn't know who they were, and they were playing, traditional rock and roll songs. The opener to this show, "Good Rockin' Tonight," right? I mean, like, and all the Gary U.S. Bonds stuff that he would play, and the Detroit medley, that stuff all came from those bar band days, and that remains the core of the band. And then Bruce sort of started
Yeah.
to layer in his own material on top of that, which goes in a different direction. But when he's ready to in the show, he's able to take it back to like good old rock and roll music. I remember this isn't Bruce, but one time many years ago, listening to a Fish show, as my dad and I were like doing some work around the house, like painting or something like that, and it was a show from '97 where they went into Johnny B. Good, and my dad after this like long jams and everything like that, Johnny B. Good starts, and he just turned to me and he was like, it always comes back to the classics, right? Like you always go back to the core of rock and roll, and Bruce is so good at the dichotomy of just having a great time dancing rock and roll, but also then being able to move you tremendously with his own material.
Absolutely. And that's a really good segue into just like where the band is at this point in time. So Darkness on the Edge of Town comes out early summer 1978. And they're touring on this record at this point in time. When you hear this album in comparison to Born to Run, which came out 3 years earlier, what do you hear as like the biggest differentiating factor of his songwriting and the band at this point?
Well, the songs I think became a lot more personal. On earlier albums, particularly the first two albums and some of Born to Run, he's kind of more telling a generic story. And in some
Yeah.
cases, as with one song we'll talk about here, he's really just making up stories and telling you stories. But with that theme of like somebody from the streets and wanting to get out of a situation, Born to Run, he got a lot more personal about that. And then Darkness, I mean, the title is appropriate because he really kind of digs down into the nitty gritty of wanting of this scene and wanting to get out and what it was really like. And songs like Factory and the title track and the Promised Land. He's starting to see the light. He's starting to know where he wants to go. But the record is also it's mixed very kind of a murky way. It was produced by Clive Davis and mixed by him, and he the I think it was Elvis Costello who actually commented like in the last couple of years at how it's his favorite Bruce album, but the mix actually destroys the songs because it's so dark and murky. Darkness was not one of my favorite albums. It's actually still not one of my favorite Bruce albums. I love the songs on it, but I think that they come across way better in the live situation, where they're more energetic and bright as opposed to this sort of darkness that you're murking in on the album. And then, of course, with the river, he's going to go even more in kind of like a fun, positive way. So this is sort of dark Bruce, but at the same time on the road, they're just this bombastic band that can get their point across with the first note of the show.
Yeah, it is wild. Like I talked about this last week in the 75 show. It felt to me listening to it just in context, like kind of the death of Dylan-esque Springsteen, where he's writing these like songs with, just run on sentences in the lyrics and these verses that are like 8, 9 lines. He's using a thesaurus. He's just like, um, he's trying to hit you over the head as much as possible with imagery and with larger ideas about like symbolic nuances within his storytelling. By Darkness, he's really kind of chipped away at that, gotten to like the meat and potatoes of what he's trying to say. But to your point, he's going outside of himself in a lot of cases. And this era for me, Darkness, The River, Nebraska, like this is when I think of like core Bruce Springsteen. Like he's he's written some of his greatest songs and he's going to write some more of his best songs as he moves into like Born in the USA and Tunnel of Love, as we talked about yesterday. But this is really like the Bruce where the image of him actually working at a factory like feels most present and actually having a lot of these harrowing stories happen to him. It feels like it's really a part of his life overall. To me, this is in some cases like where the myth of Springsteen is really written in a lot of ways. This idea of him connecting with the common man in America and speaking for them really feels like it comes through.
Yeah, and also just to comment on the quality of the songs that wound up on Darkness and the River, keep in mind that he wrote several hundred songs during this period because, not to get into it, you should watch. There's an amazing documentary about the making of Darkness on the Edge of Town called The Promise, which I think you can actually watch on HBO Max. But you're talking about how he was in a lawsuit with his manager. After Born to Run came out, and he could not release an album for several years. So he just kept writing songs. They kept recording them, refining them. So, when you look at Darkness on the Edge of Town, it's like this handful of songs that came out, floated to the top out of hundreds of songs that he was writing in his peak creative period. The every single song is a banger. And it's amazing.
Yeah, listening to The Promise, you're like, my God, there could have been like two The Rivers that came out back to back, like basically two double albums that came out back to back. What are your thoughts, and just in terms, like, set the context for us in terms of where the band was at this time before we jump into the show?
So specifically for this show, they were in the middle of a long tour, as you mentioned, which ran from the release of actually just before the release of the album through early 1979. It's interesting that they were in this period where they were playing a mixture of venues. Sometimes bands are in that space where in one market they could sell out multiple nights at an arena, and then in another market maybe they're not as popular and they play like a 2,000-3,000 seat theater. And Bruce was at that point in his life, or in his career. This show is part of a 9-show run around the New York City metro area and North Jersey, where he did play. He sold out 3 nights at Madison Square Garden, but he also played intimate shows at the Palladium and then this Capitol Theater run. So you can imagine the demand for tickets for these shows was incredible in his home area. And, he probably could have played another 5 nights at Madison Square Garden. At one point in the show, there's people like, handing him things, throwing things up, holding up signs and stuff like that. And he comments about this guy who's got a sign or something and says, I slept on the street for 4 nights to get tickets to this show. Which is just amazing to think about. The other thing is that one of the things that happened, and one of the sources of a lot of these live recordings from 1978, is that they did a handful of live radio broadcasts. And the idea there was to broadcast this stuff out in cities where he was trying to grow and trying to play bigger venues or sell out tickets, to give people a sense of what a live E Street Band show was like, because up to this point you really couldn't hear that unless you heard some sort of bootleg. And so this is the night before this show was one of those live broadcasts, September 19th, and broadcast live on FM radio. And then, as opposed to the Helsinki show that we talked, I'm sorry, not Helsinki, Stockholm, that we talked about yesterday, where there was a live broadcast of the first set, and then the second set feels like maybe they've kind of like spent all of their like creative juice on the first set. This is the exact opposite. The night before was broadcast, widely listened to, and then he comments at the start of this show, he says, it's just us tonight, there's no FM broadcast. And as a result, the performance is loose but powerful, and we get some rarities and whatnot. I mean, this is a special show, and I think the weight of trying to impress people over the radio is off Bruce's shoulders, and he's just here to have fun.
Just like from a larger perspective, like, the way that I hear this show is the way that I hear, and like my entry point to, and I think both of our entry points in a lot of cases to talking about live albums by like an artist like Bruce Springsteen, beyond the fact that we love Springsteen, is I listen to a lot of Phish, I listen to a lot of Grateful Dead, and there's a sensation in those two bands that the hyped shows, the big shows in the big market, the holiday shows, are never the best shows. They're always the shows that, like, the band in some cases feels a sense of pressure, and aspects of the show oftentimes like don't come out with as much passion. It's always the night around that. It's either the night before or the night right after. And this show has that vibe completely, where there's no pressure to perform for anyone other than the people who are in the room. How much people have been clamoring to get into this room. you're playing songs that you've written over the last couple of years and have been released on a record a few months prior. You're playing those as, in some cases, the best you're ever going to play them. Plus, you're already writing songs for your next record. And all of that kind of mixes together that sensation of like, it's just us. We're here. The pressure's off from last night. Let's just play a show. That it's a weird sentiment, like to pin on a performing artist who you would imagine you show up when the pressure's on. The magic tends to happen when you have just your fans in the room. You have just you and the community that's around you, and you hear that from like the moment that the show begins. um
Yeah.
should we jump into some of our themes here just to kind of dive into this show?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you mentioned this at the top, and I think this is a good way into this. You talked about this being the best sounding Bruce live release. I'm curious, what songs do you have to kind of like showcase that sound quality that we can like dive into, just like the overall sound of this show?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the whole thing sounds great and is a treat to listen to. But a lot of it is about I mentioned the space around each instrument and being able to hear things. A lot of that on a recording comes down to dynamics, being able to present quiet things as well as loud things so that you can hear the difference between the two. And the quiet actually sounds quiet and the loud actually sounds loud. So a great example of that is the intro to Prove It All Night. This 78, it's known among fans as the 78 intro. They did on this tour where they would sort of slowly build into Prove It All Night. And it starts out with just piano, very quiet piano, and Max is just kind of doing a rim shot on his snare. And not to overdo the fish metaphors, but it's kind of like listening to Slave to the Traffic Light, where it goes from extremely quiet to extremely loud, but there's no point in that progression where you feel like, oh, they suddenly got louder. Like it's such a subtle thing that like by the end you're kind of like pumping your fist in the air and everything's crazy, but like you came from this very very quiet spot. And throughout the course of a guitar solo that Bruce takes in this intro and builds into the song, you get exactly that. You get the whisper quiet. You can hear that. You can probably hear a pin drop in the room. But then when it peaks right before he drops into the song, it's just the biggest wall of sound you can imagine. I also love, before that song, we were talking about some of the intimacy. There's all these great moments throughout the show where Bruce, it kind of feels like he's just hanging out with his friends,
Yeah.
talking to the audience, you know, plays Independence Day for, some little blonde haired girl I met backstage before the show. I don't know your name, but I'm going to play it for you. Like, some dude is yelling for It's My Life over and over again, and they play it, which is a kind of a rarity. And
Yeah.
before this song, he shouts out his guitar tech. He's like, this guy, I bought the guitar from him, and he keeps it running real good for me. If I call him at 3 o'clock in the morning, he fixes it up, and then rips this insane guitar solo over the top of the song. So that is something great to listen to. But once again, I mean, just listening to the entire thing start to finish, you really get a sense of being in the room and what it's like. It's not a dry recording. There's a lot of audience noise in it, but not too much. And every single instrument just sounds perfect.
Yeah, the recording gives you the sense that the room is completely packed, that there are people literally hanging on the stage. At one point he talks about like, you guys got to move back. He doesn't quite take a step back, everyone, but like, everyone's got to have space. We want everybody to see, get out of the aisle, clear the aisles, please. But like, you get this sense of like, if there's a picture of, there's some great pictures from this show of the band on Bruce bass, but you get this sense that like people are literally just like hanging onto the stage for dear life because there's so much happening on here, which adds to, I mean, this is a 12-minute version of Prove It All Night. And it's one of those songs that like when it comes up on the record on Darkness, it's like 100 miles an hour the second that it starts. And it's one of my favorite tracks on the record, for the sense that like you start at 10 and he only takes you higher from there, to then have this almost inverse of the song where it starts really quiet and it builds up to that. It only adds more tension to a song that already is just like filled with tension. And
Yeah.
it's wild to me to listen to it here.
Did you go to the Bruce show at Nats Park in 2012?
No, in 2012 I saw him at Wrigley Field. I don't know if that was
Okay.
before or after that.
Yeah, I don't know, but that was one tour where he actually brought this 78 intro back just a couple of times, and one of them was at here in DC at Nats Park, and they opened the show with it.
Wow.
And a lot of the crowd, I mean, it's a huge stadium crowd, and I think a lot of people didn't realize what it was. And so people were kind of like, okay, whatever, this is this quiet thing and chatting. And by the time they dropped into the song, the entire stadium was just like roaring. So, I mean, it's a great magic trick, as Bruce likes to call it, but he's really good at it.
He opened the Wrigley show that I saw with Because the Night, which he I think had brought back on that tour and
Mm.
was playing pretty frequently, which comes up here later in this show. But one thing I was thinking about, we've touched on this a little bit, but like I'm listening to this show. This to me, this is the best of Bruce. Like this is the when I think of Bruce Springsteen, in the same way that like when I think of Neil Young, I think of Neil Young on the Tonight's the Night and like the Ditch trilogy and like the sound that you get from there. When I think of Dylan, I think of 1966 Dylan. When I think of the Grateful Dead, I think of 1972 Fish, December 95. Is this the best year for Bruce in your mind?
That's a really good question. I think you could definitely make the argument that he and the band were kind of at their peak at this point. Although I do like a lot of the elements that were added in the subsequent tours after this. The river material really added such a dramatic kind of sense to the show, and he was doing
Yeah.
more monologues and stuff like that. The shows got way longer. He started playing two sets. He started, the shows were extending to almost 4 hours every night. And here it's a little bit tighter. You got a one set show. It's still almost 3 hours of music, but it's a little bit more tight, a little bit more focused. As with a lot of the bands that you mentioned, I think best year is basically up to personal preference and what you like
Sure.
to see out of the artist. But as with the specific years you mentioned, you can definitely make a case that this is maybe the best that they ever were.
Yeah, I mean the tightness factor is I think one of the things that adds to, there's just so much energy in the show, and like when they're in between songs, it's so clear that there's no music on stage, because like the dynamics of the song being played and him just talking with the crowd, there's such a vast contrast in like the feel of the show at that point in time. It's like they're just throwing every single thing that they have into each of these performances. I don't know, it's just I was listening to it and I was just like, I had just like a giant grin the entire time I was listening, because you hear him. This isn't like 1975. He knows he's incredible. He knows that he's at this point where his music is connecting with people. He has to tour a ton to really, build up this fan base, but that touring is done in such a way that um, it sounds more joyful than it did 3 or 4 years earlier, because he knows what he has from this band. I think you make a good point though, that like the river material that's going to come is going to really round out this material, or his live show in a really incredible way. But it's wild to think that we're 7 years away from that 85 show that we talked about, where he's in a stadium, where he has synthesizers, where he has three new albums that he's promoting basically at this point in time, with The River to Come, Nebraska, and Born in the USA. that that gap between a 78 show and an 85 show, you can see the trajectory, but it also sounds completely different, because that is a fully realized Bruce Springsteen who has to cater to 80,000 fans, and this is a Bruce Springsteen who's still, it's just us here tonight.
And that's an important point because the intimacy of the venue changes when they play. One of the River songs that they played, Point Blank, is way different in a theater than it would be in an arena 2 years later. There's a sense of like, not in a bad way, but when he gets these bigger rooms, he can kind of suck all the energy out of the room and focus it on this quieter song that he's playing. Where here in the theater, there's just a very natural, like the audience chilling out, probably, possibly even just like sitting down and like letting Bruce play this quieter song and let him speak to you. But at the same time, throughout the entire show, we've mentioned this before, and I think it's important to reiterate, every single note that's played throughout the entire show has the most amazing energy behind it.
Yes.
The opening, "Good Rockin' Tonight" into Badlands, is an incredible segue and just has people going crazy. "Darkness on the Edge of Town," it almost sounds like Bruce is like screaming during the choruses. Clarence's saxophone the entire night is just like there and it's pushing you forward. But and they do some more fun stuff as well. I mean, they play "Santa Claus is Coming to Town" in September, which is kind of like a little cheeky moment, a little bit of levity. "Fire," which
Yeah.
he wrote, and I believe that was Diana Ross who played that first, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so, there's a little bit kind of like fun Bruce going on there before he gets more serious. But all of that, there's never a moment where you feel like he's just kind of like phoning it in or letting down his guard. It's all, all energy and force forward through the song.
Yeah, and like as I was thinking about like what is the best year, what is the best era? I mean, I think you're right. There's a total subjectivity to it, but like ending the first set with such a powerful performance of Thunder Road and Jungle Land off of Born to Run, it's like this. He's played so much off of Darkness on the Edge of Town in such an incredible way here in the first set, and here we're going to close out the set with two songs that you've all lived with for 3 years and are absolutely just showstoppers. And then like as you get towards the end of set two, you start to enter like songs getting extended out, like Kitty's Back. You get the incident on 57th Street that is really special for him to pull something out again from Wild the Innocent, and then Rosalita to close it out in this just massive way. But I wanted to ask you, you noted here in the doc just like this raw energy and like this like raw excitement of playing a show like this. Dive into that a little bit more.
Well, I mean, that's kind of what I was talking about, just out of the gate opening with something like "Good Rockin' Tonight." Bruce, throughout his career, he could kind of do both ways where he would sort of ease into a show. But
Yeah.
then, like on the 75 tour, they would do Thunder Road, but it was just like him and Roy Bittan and, the band's not there. And it's this quiet kind of, reverent moment. And then they bring out the band and they go into 10th Avenue Freeze Out. Here, he takes the opposite approach of just like bombastic out of the gate, doing that old good time rock and roll thing, playing the cover, and then getting into Badlands, which is, similar to what you said about Prove It All Night, like just starts at 10, like hits you in
Yeah.
the face right away. The other thing, it's kind of funny how this adds to the energy, but it's like the signature Bruce sound where like I remember growing up, anytime I heard this, I would kind of know that I was listening to Springsteen, is
Yeah.
the Glockenspiel. The which is Phantom Dan Federici playing the Glockenspiel, adds that like amazing kind of like touch to the band. Bruce
Yeah.
was he was a huge fan of Phil Spector. Famously wanted Born to Run to sound like a Phil Spector production, and this is just one of those things. It's like you got a killer rock band, but like in addition to like some amazing Hammond organ, Danny Federici is also playing a Glockenspiel, and it's just like gives it a really really nice touch without taking away. It doesn't sound cheesy. It helps build the sound of the band and help them propel forward.
It's Danny Federici was where my ears went for most of this record, and it was one thing that really drew me to this show. That's so different from the 85 and 88 shows that we saw, where the synthesizer really like and the sound is just at this bigger level, being in outdoor stadiums. being in a club and having the organ just drive this show forward is such a distinctive sound. And I was thinking about it this morning. I was listening back to this. Like, you have this combination of Bruce's energy, Clarence's saxophone that is going just 100 miles every time he plays. The energy of Miami Steve on stage, and like the his like call and response with Bruce, his vocals, his his just overall performance. Max Weinberg's drums are just in your face, so powerful. But like that organ sound from Danny Federici is just something that like we're gonna highlight him a little bit later in this series in a pretty significant way. But like hearing his approach to this sound in the 70s makes it so distinctive, and roots it in that like old time rock and roll, that bar band, but also this band that has ambitions for something bigger than just playing in a bar.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that after the Prove It All Night, which we talked about a couple minutes ago, where Bruce plays a really incendiary solo, he calls out Danny after the song for his organ work on that, and
Yeah.
how you realize that's actually, especially in like the head, that's the organ. It's like in your face, and combined with Miami Steve and Bruce's guitars like being turned up and really really dirty is just like that raw rock and roll feel.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. Um, the last thing I wanted to point out before we got into our awards here for the most Bruce moment, I was thinking about this. I don't know if I'm right. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts here, but like Rosalita is such a showstopper, and it ends the second set here. It's almost 13 minutes long. There's the great moment in the 75 show that we talked about last week where they're fading into Rosalita. And rather than like giving this big introduction and this big spiel, Bruce just goes, and just like builds the tension just with like a couple of words. Rosalita is like such a song that because there was such a gap where this song was played regularly live, when you hear it in these shows, it sounds like 70s Bruce just compacted into one song. But I was thinking about like in context of the 85 and 88 shows that we listened to, the energy, the vibe of that song feels like something he was running away from for a decade after this. I don't know if do you agree with that? Do you have any thoughts on that, like within the spectrum of Rosalita as a song?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this, I think, on the Giant Stadium show last week. There was no Rosalita in that. He, sometime during the Born in the USA tour, just decided that he was sick of playing it because they had literally closed the second set of, or the main set of the show every single night since it had been written. And,
Yeah.
they do this whole band introduction thing that they kind of work out, and it evolved on each tour. But I think like doing that whole thing, the audience wants that, and they build that anticipation because they know, if they've seen Bruce before, like what's about to happen. But I think at a certain point he was like, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to do something different. I don't want everybody to just be waiting for Rosalita and for me to do the same exact thing. The cool thing about the Rosalita on this tour versus the Born to Run tour and the Hammersmith Odeon release is that in 75 they just tear through the band intros and everything. It's like
Yeah.
they're like a speeding bullet train, and they just don't stop. They just keep going. In 78, I think they learned to ease into that section a little bit more, ham it up a little bit more. You eventually have Bruce and Clarence jumping up on the speakers on either side of the stage, Bruce jumping off the piano, all that kind of stuff they do. And you get a great sense of that in this Rosalita. But it's like, if you push something further and further and further, eventually it's going to come around and not be cool anymore. So giving it that break that he gave it, then when he started playing Rosalita again several decades later, now when it's not a guaranteed thing, and you see it in the show now, and it's like, yes, all right, we got
Yeah.
Rosie tonight.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And the only thing I would add is like it feels in a sense to me like he's 29 years old at the time of this show, and when we when we visited him yesterday in '88, he's almost 40 years old, and there's this like gap of life during that period in time. And if you listen, like lyrically, Rosalita is, as long as everything works out with this crazy career I'm chasing, like we're gonna be okay. And by the time we get to Tunnel of Love, we're talking, Brilliant Disguise, Tougher Than the Rest, the title track, like we're into these very complicated, dark, layered themes of like what does it mean to be in a relationship with someone when like things are not working out and when things are actually a lot harder, and these very simple problems that you see in your like 20s and early 30s suddenly speak to you, and like there's almost no way out. You're like painted into a corner based on life's decisions. And it's just wild to think about like how good he was at capturing that emotion 10 years later. But 10, 15 years earlier with Rosalita, he captures the like vibrancy and the energy of like simply just falling in love with someone. And it doesn't matter what happens, we're going to be okay as long as we have each other.
There's a big difference between Papa Says He Knows That I Don't Have Any Money to the Brilliant Disguise kind of vibe. I mean,
Totally.
it's a big departure there. The
It's
record
just
company has the record company's given him more than a big advance.
right. He's got everything he needs, but like, what else is there? And I
Yeah,
don't know. It was
yeah.
just wild to like listen to that in the context of this, plus the way that we've jumped around about this. All right, we have reached our awards segment where we award the most boss moment that happens. Matt, what is your most boss moment of this show?
So it's a segment of the show which, in the show that I've described as my favorite live Bruce recording of all time, this is what I listen to when I come back. I probably listen to this sequence at least once a month on this recording because it is just the absolute pinnacle of Bruce and the E Street Band, and that's Kitty's Back, and then Incident on 57th Street into Rosalita. And that's about 40 minutes of music. Kitty's Back. I have to mention, when we did our first show last week, my parents tuned in. I mentioned them turning me on to Bruce as a kid, and my mom texted me and she said, "Oh, thanks for mentioning us, and that was really nice. But you didn't mention Kitty's Back, which is the greatest song ever." And so here's the opportunity to talk about Kitty's Back and how it is really one of the best Bruce songs in terms of a live showpiece, up there with Rosalita. This is more focused on the instrumental capabilities of the band, and
Yeah.
kind of this is like kind of their jam song a little bit.
Yes.
They get loose, they make it jazzy. It's kind of like a combination of like a Van Morrison song as well as like a kind of like jazz workout. It's so amazing. And I think Kitty's Back among the general public is such an underrated song in Bruce's catalog. And then this sequence, also we should note, is the exact sequence on the Wild the Indie Street Shuffle, where they play Kitty's Back, you flip the record over at the end of side one, and then you get Incident on 57th Street, which I, just to describe how I hold this song in regard in Bruce's catalog, there's a top shelf in my mind which has, among all of Bruce's great songs, these are the perfect songs. These are the ones that you cannot really even say a bad thing about them. They are just absolutely perfect lyrically, musically, the arrangement, the performance. Incident on 57th Street, Rosalita, which they're going to play next, Born to Run, Jungle Land, and Thunder Road. Like, that's all of those
That's
songs.
the list.
These are like visions of Johanna level of
Yeah.
writing from Bruce. Incident on 57th Street has always kind of been a rarity, and that's where he gives the audience a treat this night for not being the FM broadcast audience. And you can hear when he introduces the song right before.
Yeah.
Some people are like, "Oh yeah," but the hardcore Bruce heads in the audience like gives an unbelievable performance of this song, which is, basically like a, kind of 70s Romeo and Juliet song, except it's about a gigolo, which is so Bruce and so great. And it's a great version, really emotional. But the key here is that, as they do on the album version, there's a piano outro from Roy Bittan, and they do a key change, and they go straight into Rosalita. And Bruce, as they're going into it, yells, "Look out!" And when they hit that first chord, I can just see it in my mind, the entire audience just jumping up and down screaming, and the version of Rosalita is outstanding. This is, I mean, really, that like 30 seconds of like the outro into Rosalita is maybe the best thing I've ever heard from Bruce and the E Street Band. The energy is amazing. The emotion is amazing. If you're gonna listen, I should have said earlier, I think if you're not familiar with Bruce's live output, this show is an amazing place to start. And if you really want to cut to just like give me the good stuff, listen to these three songs, and it's going to tell the entire story.
I Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think like the significance of planned rarity here, the connection with the audience, the crowd reaction, like you get this sense. There's a moment at the end of Twist and Shout where he just yells, "I'm going home," and you're just like, dude, like you're in the Capitol Theater in Passaic, New Jersey, in 1978. Like this is Bruce Springsteen's home. You know, this is where you belong. Um, for me, the most Bruce moment is like I don't want to cop out and say it's the whole show, because the whole show is just like I said it earlier. It feels like the peak of Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band all wrapped into one singular show. And what you said, like if you don't know Springsteen's catalog, if you're just curious, like this is a great place to dive in and really get some understanding of what a live Springsteen show feels like. But to me, it's that connection in the banter between Spirit in the Night and Darkness on the Edge of Town, where he's getting stuff thrown on stage by the audience, and you get this real sense that like, you know, there's so much going on right now controversially around Springsteen's ticketing for his upcoming tour. We talked about this yesterday in the lead into the '88 show, and so much of that is because there's this infectious vibe that Springsteen gives off, where when you listen to him, he's one of those artists that you think is speaking directly to you, even though he's speaking to millions, to billions of people, you know, essentially. Like your relationship with him is different from my relationship with him, is different from your parents' relationship, is different from my, you know, like all these people who have been touched by him on such a deeply personal way, where when you listen to his lyrics, you're like, man, I was really going through something, but like you figured out how to like communicate it as an artist, that like I can now get through it. You get this sense listening to his banter of this guy that was just like, he gives off a vibe that he was best friends with everyone in the room, and that he knew everyone. And the guy who slept for 4 nights to get tickets for this concert. There's a great moment where like someone throws food up on stage, and he's just like, oh, junk food. And, you know, like he like has this like back and forth with the crowd where he's like their best friend, but then he's going to play Darkness on the Edge of Town and absolutely blow everybody's mind. Um, there's that quietness to it. There's that interpersonal communication. There's so much in this show, and it's wrapped up in the set listing. It's wrapped up in the tightness of the band. It's wrapped up in the banter. I loved this show. I'm so glad we talked about it. It was a killer way to continue diving through Springsteen's archives.
Yeah, absolutely. And not to say that we kind of peaked early with giving you the best. There's a lot of really good stuff to come on these shows. We're going to do a little bit of a whiplash for tomorrow and talk about more of a modern but notable show. But there are a couple of other shows. One in particular, I'm not going to spoil yet. We'll tell you the day in advance. But that is another one that's a candidate for the greatest Bruce show of all time, which I think is actually probably more universally thought of as the greatest Bruce show of all time. Maybe they're Cornell 77, if you will.
Yeah, there is one coming up that like speaks to something we were talking about earlier in this episode, just about like what happens when Bruce adds another incredible album to his overall canon. But tomorrow we will be back. We will be diving into our first post reunion show. We will be diving into 731 2012 from Helsinki, Finland. We're back in Scandinavia, the longest show that Bruce had played to date. It's an incredible career spanning performance that has more swearing than I thought would happen in a modern day Bruce show, but he is feeling it. He is there to celebrate entirely in Helsinki before heading back to America, where I would see him just a couple weeks later. So we will be back tomorrow at noon Eastern to cover Bruce Springsteen 7/31/2012 from Helsinki. Thank you everyone for hanging with us, and we will see you all here soon.
Bye.